Hello and welcome to part 2 of the GraphQL with Django. So in this tutorial, we're going to go through queries with GraphQL. So this tutorial is going to take us through a journey looking at the front end and the back end. So actually performing GraphQL queries, having a look at the structure of those, and then actually handling those queries in the back end in Django. So this tutorial should get you started utilizing queries with GraphQL. And of course, there's lots more other dynamics that we could bring into this, but I wanted to make this a kind of a short and sharp introduction to queries. In later tutorials, we'll delve a little bit deeper and we'll construct more complex queries utilizing GraphQL. So previously, I just wanted to mention in the previous tutorial, we did set up Django with Graph. So if you have, or you still need to do that, then just head back to the previous tutorial, set that up, and then I'm basically going to start from that point here in this tutorial. So some different changes from the first tutorial. I'm going to skip now into a more complex model structure so that we can just kind of set this up for later performing much more advanced queries, etc. So I'm copying, or I'm utilizing the database that we set up with the building a quiz API series. So here we've got 4 classes here, 4 models: category, quizzes, question, and answer. So this is going to allow us to use many-to-one connections, our foreign keys. So there's going to be a foreign key between answer and question, question and quizzes and category. So I don't want to go into too much detail here. I'm assuming that you've got a general idea of how to make models for your database. So here in category, I've simply just got the name field and a understring method there. In quizzes, you can see that we've got the foreign key here to the category. So that's going to build a connection to the categories, and then just some other fields here that you can obviously extend if you want to. And then with question, we're going to have some drop downs here, or some selections. So you can see here we've got the foreign key that's connected to the quizzes table. That was the model up before the quizzes. And then finally, the answers. We've just got a few different fields here. One of them, question. We've got a foreign key here, which is connected to the question, the previous table again. And that's pretty much it there for the models. So have a look at this code. It's in the it's in the code repository. If you have a look in the description of this tutorial, you'll be able to have a look at these models. Okay, so in addition to that, in the first tutorial, we set up books. So I have made a new app here for quiz, and I put those models that you've just seen inside. In addition to that, obviously I've added that into the settings, into the installed apps, of course. In the URLs, here you can see I've got the obviously connection with include. So I've included the quiz URLs. And if we go into the quiz, we've got our URLs. And at the moment, we've just set up the one URL. So this is exactly the same in the first tutorial where we set up the path to the GraphQL front end so that we could actually have a graphical user interface and enter some GraphQL queries. So we'll do the same thing in this tutorial. Okay, so the last bit of setup here is in the schema. So obviously this is going to be changed from the first tutorial. Now I've got the 4 models that I've just built. I'm going to make a Django object type of these 4 models here. So I bring in the models as per normal. I'm going to be utilizing Django object type from the Graphene Django package. So I go ahead and create the classes, and then I just really need to just define the data that I want to return. So I've added the DjangoListField, which we'll use shortly. I've just added that in for now. I'll explain that in shortly. So you can see here we've just added a meta for each of these classes, each of our models. We just identify the actual model we're connected to and then the fields that we want to include. And obviously what we're doing here is we're just setting up our data so that it can then be queried. Okay, so there we go. So these are just all the fields that are connected to my models. So that kind of summarizes our schema up to that point. So I apologize if that's too quick or not enough detail. Like I said, or you've probably seen, if you've seen the first tutorial, we kind of covered that element, or we covered those elements previously. So the outcome of this schema document here is that we want to develop a schema. So in GraphQL, schema basically will define the types and relationships between the fields so that we can query upon it. And what we're doing here, utilizing these Django object types, is we're taking our existing models, which is obviously in Python, and we're kind of converting that or making it available for us to actually then convert into a format that we can then actually build a schema for our data. So let's just remember that the Django object type is from the Graphene Django package that we installed previously. So again, if you're following this and you haven't seen the first tutorial, you're going to need to install the Graphene Django package. If you go down to the commands text, in actual fact, it's right here, what we're doing or what we did previously. And these are the 5 tasks that we're going to perform in this tutorial. So now let's just remember, this is basically just preparing the data. So then we can put that into our query and then obviously make a schema from it. So typically what we now do is we're going to create a new class, which you don't have to call query. But we're going to call this query. So we go ahead and we just build this new class here. Now what's going to happen within this class is essentially we're going to take this data eventually and we're going to then define it within inside of this query. So once we've done that, we then go ahead and we build our schema from the query class. So Graphene schema, and then we take the query class here and we build our schema utilizing the Graphene schema, extending from Graphene to schema. So that puts it into this nice little variable here, our schema. And that's essentially what we're then going to utilize to build or to run queries upon. So if we go back into our URLs, notice that the path that we give to this GraphQL, where we have the graphical front end where we'll be able to perform some queries, we bring in the schema here. Now, I did mention previously in the previous tutorial that you could do this one of 2 ways. You can put the schema here, or you can go into the settings and you can set up the schema inside of there or define the schema inside of there. So here we're just using the URL here to define the schema. And obviously, we actually bring that schema in. So the quiz.schema, that's been brought in from this file here and obviously been taken from here. So you can start to see the path here. We set up some data, we bring it into the query, that's available then for the URL. And then obviously we can pass in queries to that essentially, and then obviously return data. So let's go ahead and build a simple query to begin with. So let's go ahead and build this new field here. So we've got this variable here called quiz, and we're defining it as a string. And then what we're going to need to do is build a resolve for this. So let's build a resolve here, and then let's just go ahead and return maybe just a string. This is the first question. Okay, so there we go. That's pretty much the dynamics of this query here. We're going to need some reference to some data. So here, what you'd normally see, what we'd do later is we build a variable which is connected to one of our model data here, or our model types here. And you can see what's going to happen is that we're going to query quiz, and we're going to resolve it by returning this string here. So just make sure the server's on and it's running. So it should start up with the code that you've seen so far. So once you started your server, navigate over to GraphQL here, and you'll be welcome to GraphQL. And you can see that that URL just matches up what we've got here in the path. Obviously, you can change this if you want to. Now, what you're looking at here is a graphical interface that allows us to kind of test out our queries on the left-hand side here. We write our queries here, and in the middle, that's the data returned. So what you need to imagine here is that React is the front end where we'll be running our queries. We'll be sending that across to our API, which will then draw out the data. So the data is going to appear in the middle here. That's the data that will get returned from any of the queries that we define. So the good thing here is that we've already built this schema. So this program, this front end, is actually taking the schema and is able to read it. So that's going to help prompt us. So you can see when I start typing in letters, it prompts us with different things. So we're pretty explicit here, and we'll start with query. So obviously we want to run our query. So that's going to be kind of our root there. And then inside of our query, we want to run something. So what's inside of our query? Well, if I type in Q, you notice that it picks up quiz. What we've defined here, our quiz here. So if we run this, in actual fact, this is going to cause an error, but let's just go ahead. So this is a valid query that we're running here. So I just run that. And you can see that we get an error. So not only do we get data, we also return an error. So that just allows us now to think about what we need to do. So here it says resolve quiz, 0 positional arguments, but 2 were given. So back at the code, the 2 positional arguments that are missing is root. Now, this probably needs a bit of a build up here, and I don't want to go into any real explanation of what these 2 arguments are. But root, let's just think about that as an entry point. So this is the entry point into our query. So we're going to run root, and then info is going to allow us to pass in some information that's going to be needed to run our query. So these are the 2 positional arguments that we're going to need. And if we go back and run our query, you can see that now we're actually returning the string. So there we go. That's the most basic setup we can do with GraphQL in terms of queries. So you can see that we've set up our data, and then we've got a resolve for it. And our resolve is simply just, in this case, just running some strings here. So what's going to happen obviously now is that we're going to change this into one of our models. And then what we return is obviously the data from the model. So let's go ahead and try this out. So the Graphene Django package comes with some really kind of handy fields for us, functions for us to utilize. And one of these is the DjangoListField. So what we can do is just bring that in. I think I did bring it in already. So the DjangoListField. So that's going to allow us to generate lists or return lists from our database. And what we're going to find here is that we don't need a resolve for this. So let's just go ahead now and build this. So what we're going to do is just return, for example, all of the quizzes. So this is just going to return maybe the title and the ID of all the quizzes that we set up. Now I have already gone ahead and set up some data in this system. Now I've gone ahead, and you can have a look at the code repository for this. So this is the admin for this system. Again, this is just taken from the Quiz API series. So we've just registered all of our models inside of the admin, the quiz, and answer, etc. So you can go off into the admin and set up some data. So like I said, I've already done that. So I am presuming you know how to do that here. So now I'm just going to go ahead and set this up. So let's go ahead and just return all the quizzes that are currently in the system. So all I need to do here, all quizzes, say, let's just go for, all quizzes. So that's my variable name, and then that's going to equal, in this case, we're going to now use the DjangoListField. We're going to bring that in so it lists all of the items, and then we just need to define the model. So all quizzes, that's going to be the quiz type. That's the model we want to get the data from. So put that in there, and there we go. So that's simply now defined. That should return all the data now inside of this model. So let's just go back here. Now, remember all quizzes. Now, what you're going to need to do here is if I were to now just type something in here, you can see that it's not picking up all quizzes. So because we've set up a new schema, we now just need to refresh, and then we can now go back in, type in all, and now you can see it picks up all quizzes. Okay, so now that's in place. We can now define what data we want to return. So if we go back into our models, quizzes here, we've got ID, title, category, and quiz. So let's just return the ID and the title. So it's as simple as that. And you can see that I am prompted for that. You can see this is available, category is available, and title is available. So I just press go or execute, and there we go. So we've now returned that data from the database. So you can see there that by utilizing the DjangoListField here, this function here just allows us to, we don't need a return. or resolve, sorry, from it. So that can be pretty handy in some situations. So obviously you'll outgrow that very quickly and you'll want to generate some more custom queries, right? So we'll need to maybe model our data in the background here to kind of restrict or exclude. And of course, we can run Django commands and we can run Django filters here in the background. So what we can do here in actual fact is we can just extend this. So we can now set out a custom resolve. So we'll do the same thing again, resolve, and then we'll just bring in all quizzes. And then obviously we're going to need to define our root and info. And then now what we can do is we can return. So what we're going to do now is, if you're familiar to Django, we're just going to create a simple filter. So what we need to do is obviously define our model. That is going to be quizzes. And then we know we're going to use the object manager. And then what we can do is, for example, just let's just start off with all. So that's obviously just going to return all the data as if you're just going to run this command here, right? So let's just make sure that works. So I refresh, press enter, and you can see that that has returned exactly the same information. So what we're building up to here, obviously, is that we can now go ahead and, for example, we can run a filter. So ID equals 1, so that's, or exclude 1, however you want to run that. So now I'm just going to return the ID where ID equals 1. And obviously I can run queries then on just the first item. Of course, I probably wouldn't want to do that. That's just to demonstrate how this can work or how you can utilize this in the background. So let's just run that again. And that just returns the one item, the ID 1. Obviously, it's been specified as the filter. So it's probably worth noting at this point, that's not the only way we can work here. So we don't have to use the DjangoListField. We can just use the graphing list option. That's going to provide a similar type of feature. So if I were to run this, for example, with graphing list, refresh, you can see that I'm returning exactly the same data. Okay, so we can extend this. Maybe we've got two resolves. We want to run them at the same time, for example. So for example, we want to get all quizzes and we want to get all questions. Now we're not making any relations here. I'm just showing you that we can run multiple kind of queries here at the same time. So now we're going to bring in the question type. So from here, we've got the question type. We've got title and quiz available as the fields. So we're just going to bring in this and we'll do the same thing again here. But this time, obviously, we'll go ahead and this is going to be all questions. And then we're going to bring in, obviously, from question to object to filter. So let's just get rid of the filters. Let's just do all on both. So you can see here, I've got two queries that I'm going to run. I can run these at the same time. So this is what I just wanted to demonstrate. So that's now set up. So if I want to collect more data from the front end, I can now just go ahead and extend this query because now I've got the, oh, sorry, I just need to refresh, of course. So now I've got the option of all questions. So same kind of thing applies here. So I can see what's available, typing in something. I can see that title is available. So I'm going to bring in that field. I press enter or run the query. And there we go. So that's the data that's now returned. So there's only two questions in my database at the moment. So that's all the questions. And that is all the quizzes that are currently available. So of course, that's going to work in a similar way if we were going to utilize the Django list field. So for example, if I change these to Django list fields here, have a look at the specifications of the Graphene Django package. If you wanted to learn a little bit more about some of these other custom fields, the documentation isn't actually completed. There are some things that haven't been created yet. And I guess this is still in, I want to say this is still a maturing technology, if you like, with Django. So let's go ahead and just run that. So refresh and just show you that that will work. And notice when I refresh, I'm given like the history. So I can, that's a pretty handy function. It remembers the history of all the queries that I've run. So I can run that in exactly the same way. So once we get to this point, what you probably want to start thinking about now is to generate arguments. So we want to specify, or we want to have more control of what data is returned. Of course, we saw that we can set up filters here in the back end, but of course that's not ideal. Ideally, we want to customize our query in the front end to return specific information. So let's have a look at arguments. So looking at the front end to begin with, the format we got here with arguments is pretty simple. So we're going to run some parentheses here, and then we're basically just going to specify our argument. So say ID, and then we can just run a number. So let's put that in speech marks. So ID and 1, for example. So we could run something like that very easily. So that's kind of the format in the front here. So obviously we want to get all quizzes where the ID equals 1. That's essentially what we're saying here with this setup. So let's go to the back end and see if we can get this working. So we're just going to let's just slim this down slightly. Let's just get rid of questions. So we're just going to work with quizzes for now to give you a simple example. So the first thing we're going to do is just return a single item. Now, what we're doing at the moment is we've been working with lists, but of course we want to return a single item. Then we're going to need to change this DjangoListField, and we're going to need to change that into a field. All right, so let's just go ahead and just use the graphene version. So this is going to be dot and then field. So we're just here just specifying the fact that we no longer want to get a list, we want to get just an individual field. So same as normal, we define the model that we're using, and now we just need to define the actual argument name. So it's going to be ID. So that's what we're going to pass across. So we're looking for ID, and then we just need to define what type of data it is. So we're going to say graphene, in this case, it's going to be an integer. And there we go. So we've just defined the name of the parameter or the variable, if you like, from the front end, and then the type of data that's going to be sent across. So now we've got that, so we can now pass that in. So now we need to kind of resolve this. So that's easily done because we can just run this filter here, right? So let's do a filter, or alternatively, let's just run get. And then that's just going to say primary key equals, and then the ID. So ID here is referencing this ID right here. Okay, so we pass that data in. That's going to then represent a primary key in the table. And obviously, number 1 is just going to return 1 item. Okay, so that's going to be a single field. So let's just go to the front end. And before actually we go to the front end, I've forgotten we need to bring this into the function. So we need to bring ID into this function here. So after info, let's just add that in so we can bring it in. Otherwise that won't work. Okay, so now we can go to the front end. So don't forget to refresh here, but you can see now that if I run this query, it's not going to return anything. It says 1 positional argument needed, and that's the ID. So let's just go ahead like before. So we're going to say ID, and then we're going to give it this is going to be ID, for example, 1. So we want to return from the database the quiz where the ID equals 1. So let's run that, and there we go. So that's passing arguments. And at this point, you can see how that could now be a little bit more powerful to generate more effective queries. So just one more example here in this tutorial. So this isn't necessarily the way to do it, but I just want to show you some of these tools. So we're just going to work this way just this once. So what we're going to do now is let's just bring in all the answers. So we're going to set this up so we bring in the answers and then also the questions. So we're going to get all the questions with all the answers. That's what we're going to be working towards. So let's just call that questions. So this is going to be a field. So we're going to return 1 question with all its answers. So this is going to be a field, and we're going to bring in question type. That's the data that we want to bring in, the question type. So that's going to be an ID. Yep, that's no problem. So then we want the answers. So again, graphene, and this is going to be a list. Now this is where doing it this way, just to show the field and the list. So obviously the answers, there's more than one answer in a question, so that we're going to return a list. So let's go for answer type. That's the data right here. So that's the data type. And then we'll go ahead and ID. We'll bring in ID again. And that's going to be graphene. That's going to be an integer again. Okay, so there we go. So we've set up that. And now we can go ahead and just make another resolve. So we'll just copy that. Obviously, we need to set that up for the questions. And this one here is going to be for the answers. So we're going to bring in the ID as per normal. And obviously what's here, this is going to need to be changed. So here we've got questions, or question, and here we got the answers. There we go. Okay, so now that's set up, let's go ahead to the front end. So first thing as per normal, let's just refresh. So let's just, first of all, let's just grab all the questions. So it prompts me all questions, and our questions, we can't grab the ID. So let's just go for title. There we go. So this is the title of the first question, or the question that has the ID 1 in this example. Okay, so that's question number 1. So let's get all the answers for this. So let's go for all answers. Now it's the same situation here. So all answers where the ID is 1. So let's bring back whatever it is we can do. So in answers, we've got the answer text. So let's just bring that back in. There we go. And refresh. And it says user error expected iterable, but did not find one for field query all answers. Okay. So what's happening here, you'll notice, is that I've selected ID 1. And remember here, the error here, if you're remembering, is that I'm bringing back a list, but because I've defined a list, it's kind of expecting more than one thing. And here you notice that I've set this up in a way that, well, it doesn't kind of work here because I've selected the ID. So I'm just returning one item. So let's go back into our model. So what I'm trying to do here is I want to get all the questions from a particular question that we've selected. So this has a foreign key here to question. So the question has an ID. So I want to make sure that I pick all the questions from my database that has the same ID as the question. So I can use this question foreign key here to actually query against that. Hopefully that makes sense to you. So let's go back into the code here. So obviously every question inside of this answer is going to have a question ID. And that's going to match a particular question, or is going to allow us to match it to a particular question. So let's go down here. Instead of PK, the primary key, we're going to say question. So the question ID. So by doing that and refreshing, now let's just go back into the code here. So the ID is still ID. Yep. So if I run this, you can now see what's happened is that return more than one answer. It returns 3. That's not a problem because there might be more than one answer, right? So that isn't a problem. So what might be the issue now? So you can see this is just a simple code error, and the key is just here where it says get. So obviously we can't use get here because get is referring to a single item or returning a single item. So this is where we're going to run a filter. So we change that to filter, and then we're just going to refresh, and then we run that again, and there we go. So we now have this question, which is just called question 1, and we have now all the answers for this question. Okay, so that's a simple example passing in arguments. So if I can just remove that and just pull this over a little bit, and zoom in. So what we have here also is, this is basically the operation. Okay, we can describe this as the operation type. So here we might have query, mutation. Mutation is going to allow us to actually send data to the database and change the database. We also have subscription, which we'll talk about in later tutorials. So we're just focused on query in this tutorial. Now, what we also have here is an operation name. So for example, we can call this whatever we like, get questions or get answers. This isn't going to affect the query at all. So this is going to be helpful in production for us to identify this query. So in addition to this, now this is obviously one way of passing in variables here or arguments. So what we can also do is we can do this at the operation level. So we can set up the arguments. So let's go ahead and do that. So for example, here, let's set out ID, and that's going to be an integer. So we're just describing integer, and that's going to equal 1. There we go. So we set up this variable here, and we've put inside of it an integer which equals 1, right? So what we can then do now is describe this or utilize this, what is variable, inside of our query here. Okay, so let's just not forget to, I was just wondering why that was causing an error. So let's do that. So we just finish off those parentheses there, and then we should now be able to run that as per normal. And there we go. So we can define the variables here up the top in our operation type, near our operation type, and we can then pass that into our query. Okay, so there we go. That was an introduction to queries. Obviously, things can get more complicated than this. There's other tools that we can utilize in QueryQL when we start thinking about making connections and traversing a graph as such, or traversing our schema, etc. There's obviously lots more things that we can discuss, but hopefully that was a good introduction for us utilizing queries, extracting data from our database with GraphQL. Thank you very much for listening. Hopefully this was useful, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.